Hello, my name is Katie O'Dare, and I'm the Associate Dean for Graduate Student Life at Boston College. Welcome to Veritas at Vinum. Veritas at Vinum is a conversation series that features prominent faculty and administrators sharing their stories, how they began their careers in higher education, the people and events that had an impact on their professional development, and what it means to them personally to work at a Jesuit and Catholic university. Archived conversations can be viewed at the Church in the 21st Century Center website. Thank you, and enjoy the conversations.
I'm Gale Kineke. I'm a coastal oceanographer. I'm also the chair of Geology and Geophysics, and I have an adjunct position at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. And so that's sort of where I am now. And I want to, actually I'm going to put on my timer so I don't talk too long, because I would rather this be a conversation. And so I'll try to just tell you a little bit about how I got here, and then, I'd be happy just to hear about the things that you might be interested in your careers, and I'd like to hear where you are. So as I thought about these kinds of settings, when I was on the other side, when I was a student listening to people talk about their backgrounds, they always seem to have sort of these really nice phrases that guided them or whatever. And I know nobody here asked for advice, but I sort of came up with three things that seemed to, for whatever reason, those are the things that kind of got me here. And the first was, do your best, which came from my father. And then eventually that kind of morphed into keep your options open. And then the third one, which probably had the biggest effect on me actually getting a PhD and ending up as a professor, was, if you have the chance to travel, take it. And that's probably what had the biggest impact on me actually getting a PhD accomplished. So a little bit of the personal side. I'm from a family of 6. I'm 5th out of 6 kids. I was raised Catholic, Irish-German mix. My parents were happily married for 51 years until my father passed away about 6 years ago. So I came from sort of the, nice, I think every family is dysfunctional to some degree, but, pretty nice family background. And, but I did leave the Catholic Church when I was in college, and it was sort of, I didn't just drift away from Catholicism. I sort of made the conscious choice based on, what I perceived the status of women in the church and church's views on birth control and things like that, and I just couldn't really reconcile those things to be sort of an active member. And I didn't go to Catholic schools. We always had Sunday school, but I really was not part of sort of the Catholic education tradition, until I came to BC. And so I just wanted to put that out there as a little bit of a background. So education was always very kind of a given when I was growing up, and both my parents were sort of first generation to go to college, and all of my brothers and sisters, got bachelors, a couple have advanced degrees, and we all took very different paths. And right now we have, I have a sister who's a stand-up comic in LA, to a sister who, was a nurse here in Boston for about 15 years, and then went to BC Law School. That was kind of an interesting coincidence. And now she's, now she does international business law and lives in Paris. And so we had, there are lots of kind of interesting paths along the way. And so that first phrase that I used was that, do your best. I mean, that always came from my father. Like everybody, no matter what the grades were, it was always, do your best. And so I can, hear, my mother's attitude, was, as you went off to school, well, have a good day. And my father was, sort of in his joking way would be, well, do good at school, And I always felt that was, as, kind of corny or trite as that might sound, it always felt like, well, that allowed you to leave your options open, And so, my father encouraged me to apply for, and I was accepted at Princeton University, and I really was not that serious about, going to an Ivy League school, you might guess correctly that my father went to Princeton, and he was also sort of one of the, he sort of felt like, well, if Princeton is going to be accepting women, I want one of my daughters to be one of the women who goes there. So I really, when it came down to it, I thought, well, how can I turn down this opportunity? And so when I got to Princeton, women had been there for about 10 years, and it was still it was still about 2-to-1 male-female ratio. And, I got a great education, but there were certainly experiences that I remember that, you think back on, with sort of a different perspective. So, for example, when we were having kind of career counseling or whatever, my boyfriend at the time would, they'd say he would find out about when all the oil companies were coming to interview, or the mining companies, or whatever, and it was very, make sure you get your resume together and sign up for the interview. And with me, it was like, oh, well, there's a earth science teaching position at a private school outside Philadelphia. You might think about applying for. Who had the better GPA? Go ahead and guess. So it was like, just those kinds of things, which, at the time you think, oh, it's sort of this subtle sexism, but it's not so subtle. It really isn't. And another, I noticed it, like we would do a lot of geology programs. You have to do a summer field camp or field course. And I had an elder geology professor, we're measuring sections, how thick are different types of rocks. And so, we're on different teams, and two of the people from two other teams start scrambling up the rocks, and I start following. And I was always kind of a tomboy anyway, and I got the, Gale, get down here. I forbid you to climb that section. And so there were things like that were, while the opportunities were always there in terms of great education, there were sort of obstacles as well. From there, I did, a short stint with the U.S. Geological Survey, and I did teach earth science. I did get the job teaching earth science outside Philadelphia. And I confess, like when I wasn't, I wasn't that great a student in college. I really, I just didn't really quite get the bug. I don't know if it wasn't because I didn't take the right classes or take the classes that would really have gotten me. But when I taught earth science, which was great because it was like, the first section's weather, the second section is oceanography, and the third section is geology. And I realized, those of you who are TAs, I'm sure you realize, or I hope you would agree that, you never learn something as well as when you have to teach it. And so here I was learning some things that, I had learned, in college, and I was teaching it at a 9th grade level, but all of a sudden having to learn it and reduce it to that basic level, that's what did it for me. I mean, that's when I realized, oh, my education has just started. So actually, that year of teaching was what really made me want to return to school. But even then, I was still, I didn't, I just didn't really know what it meant to get a PhD, and still the idea of, being a college professor was not even, not even on the horizon, not even, a goal of any kind. So, so I went to the University of Washington in Seattle to the School of Oceanography, and just loved it. It's a wonderful place to live, great place to go to school, a good place to be a poor student because there's so many really good things to do that don't cost a lot of money. At the time, it was before it had gotten. Now it's almost a suburb of San Francisco, but it's it was before it really had gotten as populated as it is now. So it was that was a very, very happy time for me. And so I think that that sort of morphed into, that second phrase I said, which was, well, keep your options open. And so by making choices about what courses or, you just didn't, I guess I didn't realize at the time, but it was, to not limit myself, like not take those decisions, like not to take differential equations or sort of the classes that you just didn't want to, but you realize, well, if I don't take that, then I'll only go this far or something like that. And so, I try, because I still didn't really know what direction I was going, I just didn't want to, I just wanted to keep all the options open. And so I started in a master's program. And I also wanted to just say something here about mentoring. There's a lot of talk about mentoring and a lot of mentoring for women in science. And I think that while it's certainly helpful to look for mentors that you feel comfortable with, or who might look like you, gender, race, whatever, but I just think the most important thing is to find good mentors. And I had just an awesome advisor at the University of Washington. His name was Richard Sternberg, and we're still pretty close. He's got children who are my age, but I got to know his family. We spent a lot of years together. We did work on the Amazon coast and some pretty rough field conditions. And I think that by seeing this guy who had a really nice family and really enjoyed his work and loved to travel, and that he had a life that looked really desirable, and so I still keep in touch with him. And I would say that a lot of the decisions that I've made along the way, he's had a really positive influence. Now, and so I think that when you find your own mentor, keep up that relationship and look for mentoring wherever you can find, wherever it may be. So then that comes to the third saying that I had was, if you have the chance to travel, take it. And that's because I had started for a master's, and I did a project. I was working on a project in San Francisco Bay, and the research that I do is, sort of understanding waves and tides and currents and how they transport sediment and mixing of fresh and salt water. And so what happens to all this stuff that rivers dump when they enter an estuary or the coastal ocean. And so I was doing some work in San Francisco Bay, and my advisor was asked to participate in a pretty big interdisciplinary proposal that was going in for work on the Amazon shelf. And my advisor said, I would just happen to be in the right place at the right time. We were, talking about how things were going. We were actually in the field in San Francisco, and he said, well, this could be a really great PhD project. And so I was like, really? And inside I was going, Brazil, And yeah, I mean, it really, that's really true. And and then I either made the mistake or had the good fortune. I said, well, if this is at the proposal stage, I'd really like to be kind of in on the proposal. And I think part of that was because the master's project I was doing was on an NSF proposal that my advisor had, and you're sort of trying to play catch up and get in his mind and what it was really all about. And I thought, well, at least I can be in on this one. And he, made the I guess the good move for me, but the mistake for him was like, okay, well, you can write it. And so he could have written that proposal. He could have written that proposal in 2 to 4 weeks, and it would have been great. We started. It probably took 3 times as long at least, but that experience in terms of getting into research was, by far one of the most valuable. And so I thank him for his patience. And so we did. The whole project got funded. I did 6 trips to Brazil over 2 years, spent anywhere from 2 weeks to 6 weeks on each of these trips. I totally immersed myself in learning Portuguese. And it was a nice experience because the ship that we used had space for probably, I think it was about 22 bunks for scientists, and then there were probably 12 crew. And you would go out for about anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks, and then we'd come into port and swap crew or swap scientists or whatever. But the agreement with the Brazilians to get permission to work there was that half the bunks were reserved for Brazilian scientists or students. So a lot of the scientists had been educated either in Europe or the U.S. and spoke English or French or German. I mean, there was always a great mix for communication. But a lot of the students didn't. And so going to the language school at the Y the summer, before I went, I would sort of, blunder through Portuguese, but, I got taken in by all of these students. And so when we'd hit port, I would go home with them for, and, spend the weekend or the week or before I went home and, meet these wonderful Brazilian families and, experience, life in some of the different cities. And, you see Rio with a family in a different way that you would see it as a tourist. And so that was I think that experience spending, a lot of people go and live abroad, and I never really had the chance to do that, although I've been to a bunch of different places. But that was actually a very transformative experience for me to just, be bold, go, throw yourself into it, and I loved that, and I never, and I still love that. So my research has taken me places like, Papua New Guinea and Australia and Gulf of Mexico, the Adriatic Gulf Alliance. Some places are not as remote as others, but I've also found myself, like in the Sepik River in Papua New Guinea in a little rubber boat with just getting kind of battered by the waves, and it's hot, and your computer just crashed again, and you're, and these kinds of things, and you just why am I doing this? And then you look up and you see, this volcano is puffing, and the year before it had erupted, and you see, sort of the big, open face of the volcano, and it's sunset, and it's going right from sea level, so this big, big cone. The volcano's name is BAM, so you've got the feeling that it's still active. But those are those kinds of things, at least in my line of work. That's sort of what part of what it's all about. And I think that I was really lucky at a time when there were still those opportunities just kind of came along where I could do these different trips, and the kinds of measurements that I made were. So we developed some new instrumentation, and so there was sort of a nice application in some of these rivers. And then, as my research developed, it's gotten more focused and more specialized, and so I can sort of choose places closer to home. And it's true, as I've gotten older, I still like to travel, but you like to pick and choose your trips a little bit more. So. So I got my PhD. How am I doing? Okay, I should finish up here. So I got my PhD in 1993, and I did a postdoc at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and did some. And I've maintained a relationship there, either as a visiting scientist or an adjunct since then, and that's also where I met my partner of 16 years now, and so I actually live, we have a house, we built a house a few years ago in East Falmouth, and so I drive in Monday morning and teach Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and spend 3 nights in Watertown at my sister's, and then drive home Thursday night, because I just couldn't imagine doing, a daily commute. But then I spend all day Friday at the Oceanographic, and for my research, I'm in a relatively small geology department, but I'm an oceanographer, and so for me to be able to spend 1 day a week, at one of the best oceanographic institutions in the country, if not the world, has been just a lifeline to be able to have that regular conversation with people, research that's connected to mine or not, but just to really kind of stay viable as an oceanographer. And so I did a postdoc, and then my first faculty position was actually at the University of South Carolina, and I was there for 2.5 years, and that's a good department, and it was a good experience, and I kind of thought that I would stay, until I came up for tenure, and but it was again, sort of the balance of the personal life, and it's the long distance relationship, and so I wasn't even really looking for a job, and I was flipping through. EOS is kind of the weekly newspaper for one of our professional organizations, and I was flipping through, and I saw this Boston College looking for an oceanographer or something like that, and it was like, really? And so so needless to say, even though I wasn't looking to relocate so soon, I applied, and I came and interviewed, and that's how I ended up here. And so then I know that this is supported by C21. I thought I'd just make a comment of sort of, what my impressions about BC were. And I have to admit, I wasn't, I just didn't really know about coming to a Jesuit Catholic institution and what that would really mean in terms of, well, anything, teaching, research, what it was like. And I have to say that, what really it did more than persuade me, but, made me very enthusiastic about coming here were, probably three people, Father Neenan, Father Barth, and Father Skian. And so some of you may know Father Neenan. He was the academic vice president at the time when I came. He's still, I guess, like a special advisor to the president. Father Barth is the former dean of Arts and Sciences, College of Arts and Sciences. He passed away a couple of years ago, I think. And so he was the dean when I was hired. And then Father Skian was, he's still, he's an emeritus in our department, and he founded the geology department. And all three of them, I had very nice conversations with them when I came. And I just felt like, well, if this is, if this represents the Jesuit tradition, I just thought these were some of the, sort of smartest, most progressive, most interesting, open-minded scholars, that I had ever had the good fortune to converse with. And so between them and the makeup of the faculty in the department, I just really felt like it was, would be a nice place to work. And, and that said, I came in and I was the first woman in a tenure track in our department, and I think that's been, it's been fine. It's a little different, but it hasn't been all that unusual in terms of just being, kind of in my field. I've sort of found myself in that position, more than once. So when I was in South Carolina, it was a department of 22 or 23, and I was the only woman faculty member. I wasn't the first they had ever hired, but I was still the only woman in in what I would consider a really big department. And that actually reminds me of one other story, and then I'll sort of be quiet. But when I was going to sea for my dissertation work, we would, each of the research cruises, I always have to remember not to call them cruises because people immediately think, love boat or shuffleboard and stuff. And so, when I tell people like, oh, life is crazy, I have a cruise coming up, it's like, oh, poor you. And it's like, for me, that means like your biggest stress time is getting all your equipment tested and working. I basically have to pack my whole lab and ship it to, other ends of the earth and hope that it works, with unreliable power supplies or whatever. So I was, so one of the, early in the project, it was, over 2 years, early in the project, everybody wanted to go. There wasn't enough bunk space for everybody who wanted to go. By about the fourth trip, everybody was like, all right, been there, done that, and you couldn't get enough people to get the work done. So I ended up on 2 or 3 of the shorter legs. I was the only woman on the ship, and one of those, I was also chief scientist, and I was still a graduate student. And so, I'm 5'3". I'm, I won't lie. I'm 5'3". I was blonde at the time, and I was a student. I didn't have a PhD yet, and I'm in charge of telling the captain and the crew where to go, what to do, what hours people are going to work, who gets to sleep in what bunk with best accommodations, and those kinds of things. And it was challenging at times. And I remember this one guy. The ship was from the University of Miami, and there was one of the electronics techs. So he was in charge of keeping the ship's science instrumentation running. And he was from Cuba, Cuban immigrant, and he was probably 60. He was, this old, grizzled guy with a cigarette hanging out of his mouth most of the time. His name was Manny. And he'd always scowl because we always had like rough weather, and so we'd send the instrument down and with these big Teflon water bottles, and if it was rough and we didn't get a good grab when we were recovering and smack against the ship, it'd break a handle off, and he'd just come up and shake his head, and you just felt like you were always doing something wrong. And he came up to me once on deck and he said, 30 years I've been working on this boat or other boats. 30 years, never had a woman chief scientist. And I was like, here we go. I was like, I just was ready for it. And he goes, it's about time. And he's like, and he basically said, you hang in there, you know. And so that was, you know, that was one of the nice moments. So, so anyway, you know, I survived the tenure process. I'm, you know, and here I am chair now, and in our department where I came in, and the faculty was 9, and I was the only woman. Now we have 3 women. We have 2 junior faculty, so we're 3 of 8 now, and we're in a search right now looking at the next hire. We've got, you know, 4 great candidates, 2 men, 2 women. They're all, you know, it's going to be a very interesting discussion, but, you know, I'm sort of seeing how things, you know, have progressed. And so here I am, you know, I swear, I think, you know, my advisor at Princeton, I did go back for my 25th college reunion just this past June, and not my personal advisor, he passed away a few years ago, but the sort of I guess he'd be like the director of undergraduate studies for the department, you know, and he was the one who, you know, advised my boyfriend and made sure to get his, you know, resume in for the oil company interviews, and he's the one who told me about the teaching position. So I kind of have him to thank for sort of the way it came. But I also, you know, I had to go to the geology reception and say, you know, I'm chair of geology department at a pretty good, you know, at a pretty good university, and you know, and so that gave me a little bit of satisfaction to be able. Yeah, I think we always have that idea of like going back to your high school or your, you know, college, like, you know, that you made good or whatever. So anyway, I've already talked longer than I should, so I'd be happy to have a conversation.